Alright guys, what's up? So I've been playing Diablo 4 for many hours, and for a good while I was pretty pleased. In many ways it is a huge step up from its predecessor Diablo 3. The graphics are much better, the story is much more intriguing. Unlike Diablo 3, Diablo 4 is an actual open world game, which is awesome. It has tons of side quests that have their own fun stories to experience. The combat feels more balanced and feels more smooth. Your hits feel more punchy. The art style is darker and grittier, which in my opinion is a lot better than D3's cartoonish appearance. And the endgame mechanics are far better. However, there came a point where I couldn't help but notice an overglaring issue with the game that only became twice as obvious after I unlocked all of my skills and found my preferred skill set combination. And that is this. Diablo 4 is severely lacking when it comes to truly interesting gear with fun and creative affixes, which really diminishes the quality of the game, and now I'm going to explain why. In most ARPGs, you have two main things to deal with. You have your skill sets that you unlock over time, and you have your gear to contribute to your build. In games such as Diablo 3, Last Epoch, or looter shooters, more specifically the Borderlands franchise, one thing they all have in common is that you will eventually reach the point where you have unlocked your skills and you decide the skill set combination that most resonates with you. But the game doesn't end there, so while you're using the same skill combinations over and over again, there needs to be another factor which shakes up the gameplay so you don't just feel like you're doing the same thing over and over again. And that is where the interesting legendary and or unique gear comes into play. In the Borderlands franchise, let's say you have maxed out your character and you've basically married the skills you enjoy using the most. Now, after a while, using the same skill set would get boring, but it doesn't, at least not very quickly. And that's all because while you're using the same skills over and over again, your guns, shield modifiers, class mods, grenade mods, and all the rest continue to change as you find fun new combinations to try. Thanks to the consistent flow of interesting loot, you don't feel burned out while continuously using the same skills, because the gear itself is constantly shaking up the gameplay loop. The same goes for Last Epoch and Diablo 3. After you find your favorite skill combinations, most people have a tendency to generally stick with what resonates with them while only respeccing on occasion. But the game shouldn't make you rely on respeccing skills in order to make the game feel less repetitive. And like any good ARPG, that's what the unique affixes on your gear exist for. In both Diablo 3 and Last Epoch, you find a huge array of legendary and unique gear pieces that each have their own creative and interesting affixes, or enchantments if you want to call them that. Affixes that include, but are definitely not limited to, being able to summon two sets of Hydra, each one receiving a huge damage multiplier, or perhaps having a treasure goblin follower that picks up common gear drops, and after picking up several pieces, it will drop a rare item, and sometimes even another legendary item, which will have yet another unique affix for you to play with. Or a set of gloves that give you a very decent chance of summoning a hive of angry giant beasts to do massive attack damage, or a scythe that has a high chance to summon a minion on kill, which means you'll get lots of them, or yet another set of gloves that allow you to leech health as you do elemental damage. There are literally tons of examples in just these two games alone. And this is also very much how the modifiers in the Borderlands franchise work too. Having so many creative affixes and modifiers in an ARPG is a surefire way to keep the game from feeling overly repetitive even after you've decided on what your skill set is going to be. Because your skill combinations aren't going to be the only thing you see happening on the screen. You'll see the affixes coming into play as well, and those affixes and modifiers will change often because legendary and unique items in these games are abundant and drop often, thus giving you a lot of things to play with in combination with one another. And interestingly enough, you don't have to wait till you reach higher difficulties for these types of gear to drop in any of these games. In fact, you can start finding these legendary items right off the bat, although they become a bit more abundant later on. In Diablo 3, you can get several of these legendary affixes before you even reach level 30. And of course, the same goes for Last Epoch and the Borderlands franchise. So before you've even had a chance to unlock and finalize your skill sets, you already have a large amount of fun toys to mess around with. But these fun toys become even more necessary after you found your skill set. In my opinion, this is the best formula for a good ARPG. After you've chosen your skills for the duration of your playthrough, it now becomes the item's job to keep you from experiencing an early burnout. And this unfortunately is where Diablo 4 currently struggles, particularly while you're playing through the campaign up to the endgame. Even long after you have unlocked all of your skills, you might come to a point where you can't help but feel like all you're doing is the same thing over and over again. And the most common reward you get by far is the legendary gear, with simple stat boosts as their affixes. Which is cool and all, but after a while you start to realize you're doing nothing other than fighting wave after wave of enemies, doing the exact same skill combinations, and the only thing that changes is that you might start to kill some of the enemies a little bit faster than before, or your defense is a little better. But there is really nothing happening on the screen that feels or looks any different from what you've been doing since you unlocked your ultimate ability. By the time I reached level 50, the only somewhat interesting affix I found was where a bubble occasionally popped up to protect me, but mind you, in the other 3 games I mentioned, I had found extremely unique affixes and modifiers very early in my playthrough. In Diablo 3, I managed to gain several pieces of legendary gear by level 30, as I said before, all of which had very outside-of-the-box affixes attached to them, far from just being a good stat boost. And in Last Epoch, I found tons of unique items that were immediately usable even at level 1. In Diablo 4, this really isn't the case. Without interesting affixes to shake up the gameplay during early and mid-game, it's hard not to feel burned out long before ever getting to the endgame, which isn't good for casual or hardcore players. Getting bored shortly after unlocking your final skill is a surefire way to guarantee burnout long before reaching World Tier 3, which is where Diablo 4's most interesting unique items finally start dropping. But even then, the unique items in Diablo 4 are far from abundant. In fact, each class only has around 6 to 8 unique items designed for said class, with only, I believe, around 13 unique items that are universally usable. And mind you, these pieces of gear are generally the only ones in the game with more creative affixes attached to them. So you basically have to grind through a slogfest all the way to World Tier 3 before you'll have a better chance of scoring loot that can actually shake things up a bit more. Now, Diablo 4 does also have the Paragon board, which has a few interesting additions to increase playability, but unfortunately, even the board itself is generally lacking in creativity, innovation, and outside-of-the-box thinking, and instead greatly revolves around more stat boosting. Now, before you say it, I already know. Last Epoch and Diablo 3 came out way before Diablo 4, and had tons of time to add in all those unique toys, whereas Diablo 4 just came out. And you're right, Diablo 4 has not had nearly the same amount of time to cook as the other games have, but that's not really the point I'm making. The point I'm actually making is this. Why would someone choose to play a slogfest where you grind and grind only to feel more and more like you're running on a wheel, doing the exact same thing over and over again, and getting nowhere when there are other ARPGs out there which reward your time and constantly give you creative and new things to play with as you push toward the endgame? Games that cost far less for that matter. Without unique and creative items to shake things up, it's going to be very hard for many players to not experience early burnout before reaching endgame. And sure, Diablo 4 does have a few interesting aspects that you can attach to gear via the Occultist, but each one is one-time use, so you'll want to save the really good ones for when you get closer to max level anyway, so those don't really help much for keeping the early and mid-game interesting enough to play either. So for me, as well as many other players, right now Diablo 4 feels far too repetitive in its current state, but this doesn't mean I hate the game. On the contrary, I want the game to succeed. I want it to flourish. But the way it is currently, I just can't help but feel burned out. So I decided that I'm going back to Last Epoch while Diablo 4 continues to cook, and hopefully in some months' time it will be in a better state and truly surpass its predecessor in every single way. I also think the skill tree in Diablo 4 itself is a bit too oversimplified, whereas in games like Last Epoch, each skill has its own skill tree, and the nodes you choose to spend your points on will have tons of drastic effects on how your skills both look and work. Like, your fireball might shoot in a wide range, whereas mine might shoot in a more semi-automatic style, with each fireball also being electrically charged. Diablo 4 feels very cookie cutter. Your pyromancer will be pretty much the same as my pyromancer in terms of the skill sets, except that you might be using fireball while I'm using incinerate instead. Beyond that, our pyromancers will basically work and feel pretty much the same. But the oversimplified skill tree can easily be forgiven if the affixes on gear is interesting and creative enough, and I really hope that as Diablo 4 continues to cook, it will reach the prestige that we all hoped for. It was actually pretty hard for me to come to terms with these issues. I never pre-order games, but I pre-ordered Diablo 4, and I kept telling myself to just keep grinding, it will get better, but it really didn't. It really felt far too repetitive, and eventually I had to accept that this was the case and step away for a while. But perhaps in time that will change after Blizzard has more time to really flesh it out so it can stand up to other ARPGs in every possible way. I really hope that, and I think it will happen. I'm almost certain of it, in fact. But right now, I'm going back to Epoch, and I'm having a lot more fun in the meantime. And hey, you know what? When D4's first season arrives in July, maybe it will include everything that was initially lacking, and I'll never speak of this again. Who knows, right? But anyway, folks, this is just my hot take, really. I definitely don't speak for everyone. However, after posting about this subject a few times on the forums, I was surprised at just how many people agreed with what I had to say. So I know a lot of fans out there are having the same issues with the game that I am, and that's really why I felt to make this video addressing them. If you made it this far into the video, I really appreciate that. Even if you disagree with everything I said, I still really appreciate you. If you enjoyed the content, please leave me a like and hit the sub button. And please feel free to leave a comment, even if it's just to scold me. I don't mind. Thank you so much for joining me. This is XS Player, and remember that the world may be cold and unloving out there, but I will always love you more than life itself. Alright, that's it guys. Bye for now. Later.